Welcome on behalf of the BioProducts Institute. Yesterday we had a seminar on techno-economic analysis. Today it's a little bit different. The subject is related maybe more to topics closer to what you do, the researchers here that I see in this room. We have a very nice group of visitors, 5 members of a group that sits pretty much in mid-Sweden University in the beautiful city of Sundsvall. And also we have our colleague Bruno, also coming, but in this case from Portugal, but with very strong connection with the group in mid-Sweden University. So there is a lot of Swedish atmosphere today here because Emily, myself, we have spent some time in Stockholm.
And
so.
Harry, that just walked in.
Oh yeah, and Harry too. So it's great to have this little community. We have also Martin.
What's the time?
Martin is coming from NC State visiting Johan Foster, and we have Ingo Burger coming from ETH on a sabbatical, and I have also here in the back colleagues coming from UTC in Spain and University of Torino. Milano. Great, so welcome. This is great to see such a diversity. The group is also composed, for your reference, people from all walks of life, working in different areas, and they are eager to learn from what you do, Magnus and Bruno. We have a duo today, so this is a real treat. I hope we can manage the time, but that would be very interesting to see the two perspectives from the researchers that are visiting us today. The idea here is to have the two, roughly half an hour and half an hour, and as you know, the shorter the better, so that we have also room for questions at the end, and we keep questions to the end. So that's roughly the plan that we have for today. I first would like to make the land acknowledgement for those of you who are visiting. Maybe you are not too familiar with what we do in Canada, but this is a very nice practice, a very meaningful one. Before any large gathering, we acknowledge the land, the territories where we gather, and today, of course, we are gathering in the traditional ancestral Anunsi, the territories of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, the Stalo, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. This is very meaningful because really this land, this campus where we sit, has a very large heritage, a very meaningful heritage historically. We have an anthropology museum. I don't think it's open, but it will be in your next visit. It would be very nice for you to visit. This really tells you all the culture that was being developed here and continues to develop in British Columbia and in our university here. So you can read a little bit about the bio of Magnus, very diverse. I know he studied spent some time in KTH. He also spent time in Australia, where the really great knowledge in the area of colloid science really was very active in Lund University. And then you have also experience as a CEO of a company, I understood, in Sundsvall, in Mid-Sweden University. And they have a very nice group of researchers, very active in the area. So that's Magnus. I make it brief. And we have also Bruno from the University of Algarve in Portugal. More or less similar sort of background. Also had time in Lund University, maybe with Björn Lindman. I know Bruno by reference since a long time ago because they had a very nice paper related to the reason why cellulose is insoluble in water, and one of the aspects relates to the hydrophobic effects, right? So this is a very interesting, still in debate discussion about why cellulose, being so hydrophilic and decorated with so many OH groups, still is not soluble in water, right? So it's a very interesting discussion. So welcome to all of you, and welcome also to the colleagues from Mid-Sweden University, and also Martin and Ingo and the visitor from Italy and Barcelona. This is amazing. Magnus, all yours. Forward,
Yes.
Pointer, back.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Orlando. We are really overwhelmed both about the reception today when we came here and all the audience that came to listen to us We hadn't really planned for these big occasions, but we got the chance. So thank you very much, Orlando, for giving us that, to present some of the research that we're doing at the different places in Sweden and Portugal. And my title of the work here that I'm going to present is around triboelectrics of cellulose materials, and a bit about the understanding of why it works as it does, or at least a way of trying to understand how it works, since it's a quite obscure thing. Especially with polymers in general, the triboelectric properties isn't that straightforward as for metals, for instance. So I'll try to give you something about that. And first of all, where are we? Sweden. And you know Canada is very far away, so it takes about 10, 11 hours to go there. And so in Sval, where I come from, it's about 500 k's, 400 k's north of Stockholm, capital. And we have a quite small university, very much focused on research within the forest industry, since we are situated in exactly where the heart of the forest industry is located, in the middle of Sweden, north part. The campus, very beautiful campus, so please come and visit us. And we have some research centers also that are more directed to different kinds of research. And my center is the FSCN, which works with forest industry and material development. So in this center we have some research groups, and you might recognize some of the names there from your collaborations or so on and so forth before. We have some guest professors, as you can see from this list. So Orlando is also a guest professor since about this year, started as a collaborative partner to us. And Bruno is a visiting professor since some years ago. And earlier on we have had in our group also Professor Björn Lindman as a visitor professor. Yes. What are we doing? Yeah, we are working with cellulose a lot, and that is what I'm going to tell you today. And we are using water-based dissolution methods. And as Orlando started with, water and cellulose is usually not a good combination when it comes to dissolution. And it's a bit strange due to the functionality you have, but there are also a lot of different explanations in the history about why it is like that. And recently, or not recently, but at least it was picked up for some years ago by Björn Lindman, who claimed that it's very important. If you look at polymers in general and so on, there are hydrophobic interactions that are important for solubility. And you might not see it immediately from the chemical structure, since it might be very, very small things that actually act in the direction of the hydrophobic interactions. But you will recognize it if you do research around it. So we started with this work in 2015 about looking at how to treat cellulose materials in different ways by using water-based solvents, and usually we use these urea hydroxide combinations since it's a simple system. And so we have been working with both treating lignocellulosic pulps. They are not dissolving, but they are partially dissolving. So you can use that as doing plasticization and other stuff that makes a material a bit different than for instance, ordinary fibers. And of course, if you go in a very much better pulp where you have high cellulose purity and not too high DP, you are able to completely dissolve this material, and that is what we are doing also. Let's see here. And we are studying fundamentals of the dissolution, but also the regeneration, what can happen when you do the regeneration, since that has not really been penetrated that much. People have been doing this in different ways in the past, making rayon fibers, viscose and lyocell, pulps and so on. But in the academy, you don't read that much about the regeneration process and what that makes. Since that is completely different to ordinary fibers, you cannot do these kind of things with cellulose, since you are able to control certain stuff when going from solution to solid material again. So, yeah, as mentioned, the cellulose is an amphiphilic polymer. That is one of the things that we have picked up and worked on a lot and tried to really show more about. So we've been working with emulsions, for instance, which is a good study case to see how cellulose in solution might actually go to different surfaces or interfaces between oil and water. And Orlando was actually opponent to one of our PhD students, Carolina Costa, just some year ago, when she presented her thesis. And you know, surfactants, you have a very outspoken, I mean, it's very outspoken where you have the hydrophobic tail and the hydrophilic head group, and in this case, the normal SDS is a representative of that. But in cellulose, you don't see that outspoken structures, but you have. If you look at the cellulose polymer in different from different angles, you can see that you have an overrepresentation of the CH bonds in one plane, and you have overrepresentation of OH groups in another plane, which means that it has a bit different properties depending on which plane of the molecule you look at. And that will affect how it also associates, for instance, or is dissolved. So back to this, and let's talk a bit, a short thing about this lignocellulosic pulp, what we have done, but it's very just illustrative in a way, showing you a small film here where we were treating. I did it wrong still. Treating paper stripes in a small setup to be able to twist into yarns and do some kind of treatment on the go, so to speak. So you can do certain plasticization things, and you can actually do this just to evaluate where you get. And it's very simple in a way, but it worked well, quite nice to get an idea about what happens with the fiber material when you do this treatment. So it was quite elegant. When you play with Lego, you can do a lot. Okay, but now we're going to dissolved and regenerated cellulose. And when we have cellulose solutions coming from these fibers that you remember, these dissolving pulps from Domsjö in the area of Sundsvall, around Sundsvall, and we do this mixing, freeze, thawing methodology, and with sodium or lithium hydroxide urea usually to get a really, really nice solution. And then we can cast and make films. And those films, the regeneration which is needed, I mean here, that may control, or it is controlling absolutely how the film will look like or act like afterwards. And that is also the basis for the triboelectric research we're doing. The good thing with cellulose, except that it cannot be melted, is if you have solutions, you can actually mix in things. So in this case, you can get real nice combinations of different particles or polymers together with the cellulose in a dough. And it's, I mean, compared to nanofibers or fibers, this is a really, really intermixing thing. It's not separated phases. Yeah, it's separated phases, but it's really, really going into each other. So you can make nice nanocomposite materials. You can actually also do different kinds of materials from this mixture where you have cellulose as one component making it maybe stronger and another component bringing some other functionality to the material that you would like to make. You can see this, for instance, this blackish paper is a graphene cellulose mixture, and it's quite nice properties. And you can also put in, of course, fibers. If you use ordinary pulp fibers together with dissolving pulp, you get an old cellulose composites where you have the fibers that are not dissolved in a matrix of dissolved cellulose. And since you're aware of this kind of welding things, you can use this also to weld different kind of composites where if you make directions of how to put the fibers, you can do a different kind of sheets. You can even see them here with where we put layers of films and wedge them together. Wedge them together, and they are actually really nice material that gets very nice mechanical properties and can be used for other stuff than usually think. Cellulose to replace plastic in many ways. So you can form them, you can do whatever, you can make these kind of bread bag clip. In Sweden we usually have these plastic ones, but why don't do it in cellulose? I mean, they work perfectly. They're very strong, you can do whatever. And you can also imprint things when you dry them, so you can get a lot of structures that you just do by imprint. And if you use that, of course, if your cellulose is not, I mean, the surface chemistry of a normal cellulose is not really good for getting super hydrophobicity, but you can get the structure, so you can get much higher contact angles only by putting these structures. And triboelectricity then. Yeah, you already know a bit what it is since you from your childhood and also now in the modern life you get this problem with your hair. And when you walk on certain floors and put your hand somewhere, you get some kind of spark, and it's not nice. And of course, thunder and lightning, you have it in a larger scale. But you can actually use it for actually doing things where you don't need, you actually create your own power supply without any need of any other kind of battery or other things, just by frictional contacts and playing with different material properties that comes together. So you might know that there is some kind of series where one tried to put different materials related to this triboelectricity performance, and one has materials that are electron donors and electron acceptors. And this is not a completely, you cannot trust this perfectly, since usually it's very rough. And material is not really what it says always. I mean, yeah, one material can be in another way, in another shape, even though it's in the same chemical, it's the same chemistry, but it's not the same physical appearance or something like that. Depending on that, some of the polymers are semi-crystalline, for instance, and some things is related to surface structures and so on and so forth. But anyway, we are trying to go deeper here and look more at cellulose in this series, first of all. But we're also interested in lignin and other biopolymers, since biopolymers is our thing. And the balloon thing, that's another example where you use this actually. And you can say that there is an adhesion here, and a lot of the old adhesion research is actually related to triboelectrics, at least when you're in air. In water it's a bit different, but in air. So it's quite interesting. And the triboelectric generator is a setup of two different materials where you have electrodes on both sides, and then you, for instance, press them together, and then you get a charging, and then you separate the charges due to these frictional forces, and then you get an induction on the other side of the electrodes, and if you have this circuit, you can let the electron go. back and even out the potential differences. And then you can do it all over again and you get it. So in this way, you can actually make a lot of energy, or a lot, you can make energy. But key factor is surface charge density in certain ways, electron dissipation, how it looks like in the material, effective contact area, of course, is important here. And what can this be used for? Yeah, for instance, when we see a lot of sensors coming into our society, and it will be more, we want to measure everything, and we want to keep track of it all the time. This could be one solution that is quite cheap, quite sustainable anyway, and very necessary, and very low maintenance compared to if you have batteries in your sensor systems that you need to exchange. Or, yeah, it's all wireless, so you can have self-sufficient systems in sensors. But you can also scale it up, and this is a real paper from Songling One's group, where they did this blue energy harvesting, wave harvesting, doing it by having small balls where they had small minor balls, and the surface was a bit different, and when the waves are moving, the balls are rolling, and the balls inside are also rolling and touching, and the friction gets you the electricity, and then you can connect them together and harvest a lot of more energy. Yes, our research center, FSCN, has worked quite a lot with triboelectricity in general. I think we are the biggest contributor in Sweden and one of the biggest in Europe, I would say, in this area. So this is some years ago, some of the articles that came out. So one of our colleagues in the material physics group is a very well-known guy, Renwing Zhang. And we also have the guest professor. We have had Songling Wan as a guest professor working with us still. And Ya Yang also. And we have been now in a joint project together with that will start together with Orlando. We're going to look at more this series and why cellulose gets where it gets. Since paper, cotton, and wood is placed in the middle of the series usually, but if you start to work with it, you can see that especially cellulose, goes to the most positive side. So it's one of the most positive, tribopositive material on Earth that is found, and it's not synthetic. And you want to have this division between tribopositive and tribonegative. And if cellulose could contribute with being a very sustainable material compared to many other materials and cheap, then it would be really, really a thing. But we need to understand how to make it happen. So we want to bring this, for instance, in both ends. You can do it since cellulose is, easy to derivatize in different ways and make other functionalities. But you can see if mass production of cellulose is large, and if you bring the efficiency a bit higher, then it's really, really good situation. And some years ago we did this. We didn't think that we would succeed with getting this high performance from cellulose. We did a whole green cellulose graphite TENG. We had graphite as electrodes and cellulose in different kinds of cellulose together in the tribal layers. So one of our own cellulose and one commercial cellophane was put together. And we got an astonishing, we didn't believe of ourselves, so we need to redo this several times at different labs. We got 300 watts per square meter as a power output. And of course we don't do 1 square meter, we do smaller pieces, but if you scale it up or put them together, then you can reach these kind of effects, since it's a bit dependent on how large the surface is. So you cannot just go making a larger surface. You need to do several smaller ones and put them parallel. Yeah, this was quite amazing, and this is yeah, I think this comes from that cellulose. And typical demonstration of a TENG, you find it everywhere. When ring is clapping together, it's just to show how it can sign up an exit sign. Since this is one of the applications you can use it for. I mean, if you have a power breakout and you have these kind of things, and you're walking in a corridor which is dark, and then you walk on the floor and you have the triboelectric functionalities under the floor, you will light everything up. That is quite interesting. So this was how it looked like when we went into looking at the more of the structural things. We did the characterization with different XPS and FDI, and then we measured how the cellophane and our cellulose worked like, and we got a really high positive charge for the R cellulose that we made. And if we look at the triboelectric series, we also saw that this was actually on the positive side compared to the other ones. So this is a triboelectric series in that we did from our perspective, looking at cellulose. Something that is a bit strange, that is you cannot completely pair together to see the effects. I mean, if you look at electrochemistry in normal potentials, you always know exactly when you have two methods with oxidation reduction, you know what you will get out. But triboelectrics, that is a bit of obscure thing, and that is also why you can have this kind of circular dependency where you don't get, suddenly you start to get other effects that is not completely understandable, and we want to know more about that. On this side, you can see how the power output looked like when you had different load resistance for this triboelectric. Okay, so right now we're doing a job that is actually submitted and probably will go into a paper together with Orlando and also Heider at Aalto University. And we are looking at how to change the properties of the cellulose films by playing with the regeneration. And so we studied a series of alcohols with different hydrocarbon chain lengths just to get some kind of systematics into it. And what happens, of course, you can get films with different surface structures. You can see it gets rougher when you go to higher alcohols. And a more important thing, I would say, if you check this plane in the XRD, you can see the hydrophilic plane of cellulose is changing in the XRD when you go to the alcohol. And that also tells you that you change something that is very interesting possibility to do. So we were going further and investigating that in this series. And then we used two different counter layers, PTFE and PDMS, towards the cellulose. And we measured how it looked like. And we saw that if we used PTFE, which is a quite hard material, high E modular, we didn't see any changes. If we looked at PDMS, we saw changes, and we start to think what it was, and we know that PTFE is more tribonegative than PDMS at least. But that couldn't explain the whole thing, so it was something more that did this, since we came to the same value, but since the surface roughness is one of the parameters, it could be utilized better if you have a softer outer layer as a PDMS, which is a very soft layer. So we saw that we have an effect, and it's not only related to surface structure, but it's also related to this change in crystalline structure. We did also some characterizations on how the A moduli look like for the different material. And if we look at the cellulose, we have some changes. At least you have a wider distribution for the pentanol and also a bit higher value for the modules. But it's not extremely big changes. But compared PTFE and PDMS, it's a lot. What we want to do also is to do filtering, since that is another way of using this triboelectric, in fact, airborne particle filtering. It is used, but not with, I would say, any directed knowledge in the past. I mean, we have these kind of effects, but we haven't understood that they are there and they could be important. So we want to direct this into more efficient filters by using our knowledge, both in cellulose but also in triboelectrics. And one thing is you can benefit from these kind of filters is that you can make them with much larger pores and still be effective. You use triboelectrics to capture particles on the material surface, which means that you have a lower pressure fall and you can save energy in the ventilation systems. But you can also think about the face masks, of course, and easy breathable face masks as one thing. We have a newly started PhD student in the area. She started this February, so she's on her way now. And we have some more possibilities in the group. The project that I mentioned, Orlando is also involved, and Bruno also. We have an open position that closes May 21st, so if you are interested, you can apply for it. It's funded by the Swedish Research Council. It's very nice that way. And hopefully we have an upcoming collaboration between UBC, Sweden University, and the filtration company Canfield. We are quite sure that we will get through this, and then the PhD student will be on site 1st of January, hopefully next year, and it will spend at least 1 year here at UBC and 3 years in Sundsvall, or some in the middle. It depends on what has to be done and so on. But that would be very nice. This is my last picture and an acknowledgement. People in the group, some of them have left now, but most of them are together. We're still collaborating with Björn, even though he's retired from us. And some of us are here today. You recognize them. Håkan will come later on. And Bruno, visiting professor, Orlando, guest professor, and Ren Bing Sang at the material physics group, who works with us with the cellulose works. And we have some financing and other collaborations, of course. And we also have Song Ling Wan as one of our contributors, as a mentor and institute officer. Okay, that's what I had to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you for including UBC and also my name in this conversation. I think this is going to be an opportunity that will grow. They are part of 3 CERCs in Sweden, and you know already because I have advertised this a lot. We built a strong collaboration between Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, and UBC. And what we hope is to have very dynamic exchange of researchers and students. So this is just the beginning. Magnus, I really appreciate how pedagogical, clear your presentation was. I'm sure everybody here also agrees with me. Rather than having questions now, I propose that we shift to the next presenter so that we listen also to Bruno, and then at the end, we go for questions and answers. So I hope that you agree with me, but that would be the most effective. So thank you so much, Magnus, and I will call you again to come back for the questions and answers, and I hope there will be many. So thank you so much. Bruno, welcome. Let's go to Portugal, from Sweden to Portugal.
Thank you so much for the nice words and for hosting our stay here. And like Magnus said, I feel overwhelmed with this reception, and it has been so good so far, and I believe it will be like that during the next couple of days. So I'm Portuguese, and this is a picture from our university in the southern part of Portugal. And today my job here will be kind of briefly show past projects and some stuff that we are working on. And if you feel that there are some things remotely interesting, just try to approach us, and we'll be around for the next couple of days, and I'll be glad to discuss with you. But before doing that, let me just say that I'm very happy to be here, but today is a very important day for Portuguese people. We are celebrating the 49th years birthday of democracy in Portugal. So it's the day of freedom, something that we call the Carnation Revolution, because the revolution was done without blood in the streets, and there was this lady then putting these flowers on the weapons. So it's something very symbolic, and we end up one of the longest fascist regimes in Portugal and in Europe. So that's very important and meaningful. So let's go to the scientific content. Coming from Portugal, I have to advertise the beautiful area where I'm living at. I don't know if you are aware of, but we have beautiful coast, beautiful beaches for the golf lovers, beautiful golf courts there too. And we have an international airport. We also do some science, and that's what I'm going to share with you today a bit. Hopefully trying to convince that the science is as good as the landscape. We'll see. So I'll briefly introduce the research center where I'm working at. Then motivation about biopolymers, I could easily, and I'll skip most of this. I mean, it's you are in a BioProduct Institute, so you know this better than me for sure. And then the core will focus on this, on the ongoing stuff and some recent, some past projects too. So I'm working at a place called Mediterranean Institute for Agriculture, Environment and Development. And as the name suggests, everything is around Mediterranean. So from heritage to food to lifestyle, you can name it. So everything in this institute focuses on Mediterranean stuff. And we have three campus around, so two in the Alentejo area and one in the southern part where I'm hosted. So this is Portugal, tiny fraction of Spain, but we are not Spanish, okay? And we have Spanish in the so there are three, let's say, main areas in Algarve. One related with agriculture and forestry, where people do activities related to ecological and molecular approaches to improve crop protection and production. Also stuff related to agronomic value of these Mediterranean crops. And then some people working on the pesticide development for this kind of crops. Then we have other groups working on food-based projects, where the goal, again, to deal with Mediterranean commodities, food-preserving technologies, a lot of packaging going on here, and then innovation on the food products, trying to develop new food matrices and so on with these Mediterranean-based sources. And finally, a third area of action related with plant bioresources, where we do stuff related with bioprospecting and screening new phytochemicals that eventually can be used in different areas, including pharmacy, mainly focusing on plants coming from our area, from Algarve, which somehow are endemic and are rare. And to work with them, we have to develop so-called plant propagation methods, in vitro propagation, so we can have enough material to extract components and so on. And then a research line, which is the one that I'm more focusing, I'm coordinating. This is more the biology stuff from the group that works on. I'm a chemist by training, and I'm doing more on the biopolymer dissolution and regeneration. And what we do, okay, so I'm hosted in this plant biotechnology lab. Some of the people there, if you want to know more about the activities we are doing there, I kindly invite you to go through our webpage, and you know more people and you know more about the lab activities. So in the lab, there are a lot of biologists, a lot of bioengineers, that do stuff related with in vitro propagation, germplasm conservation, chemical and biological characterization, and I'm the guy trying to develop this research line on biopolymers and bio-based materials. And what we do in this research line is working with different kinds of biopolymer sources, trying to learn about the fundamentals, essentially in the very beginning, trying to understand how different solvents work or how they don't work, and develop new ones and improve the solvents that we have. And eventually, once we get the material into solution, shape it into different applications, different formats. So that's pretty much what some of you also are interested, I guess. And we have been using different raw materials, but of course lignocellulose and has been something that has been quite close to our research. Different types of waste residues that we have been working on, and some of them more specific from the Algarve region too. Of course, cellulose has been the core of my research when I started to work on this in 2010, I would say so. The motivation is obvious. I always show this number to try to impress the young kids about how available this material is. This, of course, is an estimation, a rough estimation, but gives an idea about the magnitude of the biopolymer. And applications of cellulose and cellulose derivatives are a lot. So we have a lot of applications, as you know, for sure. But in most of these applications, the challenge is related very often with dissolution, since, like Magnus said, we don't melt cellulose that well. And due to the very complex hierarchical structure, complex interactions going on, it's painful to have a nice and clean solvent working directly with cellulose. And in Portugal, we try to do that very often. We end up always burning cellulose. This is a picture from 2018. I learned that Canada also suffers from these massive fires very often, and in Portugal we suffer a lot from that. So it's really a pity to see all the available lignocellulose ending up in the carbon dioxide that we generate and so on. Obviously, there are a lot of solvents that have been developed through the years, some that put some chemical modifications, some that are direct solvents, some that are organic based, some that are aqueous based. But I mean, if you look to the chemical details, you know that somehow they are limited to lab scale applications, some of them due to toxicity, high cost of production, recovery, etc. And like Magnus said, Bjorn Lindman a couple of years ago tried to look at the available literature and see where we could collaborate, or what could be our input there from a polymer point of view, since he was and still is a very knowledgeable guy in colloids, polymers, surfactants, and everything else he could name. So I started working with Bjorn in trying to analyze what the cellulose community was discussing about cellulose, and we were not inventing anything new, to be honest. So we were just highlighting, like Magnus said, the amphiphilic character of cellulose, and therefore we cannot neglect the hydrophobic contributions. While up to that moment, most of the people focused very much on the hydrogen bonding factor. And just so this picture, I should have checked your presentation before. So you clearly see the spatial asymmetry where you have these hydrophobic and more hydrophilic areas, similar somehow to surfactants, and eventually to other molecules such as DNA, where you have these different amphiphilic regions. And therefore, you have to consider hydrophobic interactions for sure, for the dissolution, also for degradation. Cannot neglect that. And one way to show that, for instance, is to compare two solvents, alkaline-based, sodium hydroxide with a small inorganic cation, sodium, and tetrabutylammonium hydroxide, where you have this amphiphilic-like cation. What we observe is that that system is much more efficient in terms of dissolution, and we have an amphiphilic-like cation that is dissolving better an amphiphilic-like molecule such as cellulose. Of course, this is to make the long story short, and you also see different in terms of regeneration, some kind of crystalline things staying that we believe that the dissolution is not so good as in that system where we get something more smoother. We have backed the data with different techniques and so on. But the message is that amphiphilic-like solvents might help in the dissolution process. Okay? And then, once we dig a bit in the theory, we were also approached, Björn was approached with some Swedish entrepreneurs to try to apply this in the textile area somehow. Can we go from forest to textiles? And at that moment, I didn't know anything about textiles. I still don't know. But the motivation behind it's quite obvious. It was not obvious to me at the time, which is we have so many people in this planet. It's growing quite fast. And this number still scared me at that time, and it still scares me, which is people predict that in 2050 we will need something like 2 to 3 times more fibers than we need nowadays. And that's a massive number. And we know that cotton alone cannot hold that demand. We know that synthetic fibers somehow, they come from a non-sustainable resource. So eventually we will run out of petroleum one of these days. Perhaps we are still far away, but if we want to think about sustainable alternatives, we should think about them right now. And that was, let's say, the beginning of my interest in the cellulose world. Yeah, the idea was to increase this so-called cellulose gap. Like Magnus said, we already have a viscose and lyocell process, but we want to contribute with something more friendly, something greener, so new solvent systems that could somehow compete with the existing ones and produce fibers with compatible properties. So I was involved in some of these projects in the very beginning, some symbols, some companies and institutes that you might aware. So this was essentially founded from Sweden. And well, some of the solvents were quite nice. We ended up spinning some fibers. We got a proof of concept and so on. So this was a fun project to work with in the very beginning of my career with cellulose. Of course, at the time we were also interested on the fundamentals, and it's always tricky to say how well dissolved the solution is. I mean, I can look at naked eye, it's transparent, I say it's dissolved. But if I put there under optical microscope, I might see some particles there. So it's dissolved, how well dissolved it is. If I go to submicron, I still might see some aggregates, colloidal aggregates. So it's always tricky to say that something is dissolved or not. And we have done some work together, essentially with Daniel Topgaard from Lund University, a key guy for NMR methodologies. So we were looking at alkaline and acidic solvents. And the idea here, using some of his approaches, solid state NMR, I don't know too much about the technical details, but essentially, if we have a bad solvent with this technique, we would only see the blue signal, so the solid contribution of the signal. If we have a really good solvent, we would see the red signal, let's say the liquid contribution. And based on that, we could kind of quantify how much material was dissolved or not. We could do spectroscopy because we have also the peak position. I mean, it's a very powerful technique that was not used before in cellulose, and we have introduced it to the cellulose world. Keeping the track of new techniques to characterize cellulose, we end up doing some work also with Ishi Talman from Israel, which is a known guy in terms of electron microscopy. And the idea here was to, well, the problem is in these cellulose solutions, you often have a lot of salt there. They are highly concentrated, acidic or alkaline solutions. So to vitrify the species, it's always very tricky. And Ishi has the knowledge to try to solve that. And we were able to do that on the sodium hydroxide-based solvent. And here we were also interested on the role of urea, so an additive that very often we use to improve the dissolution. And urea is known to break hydrophobic interactions, for instance, in proteins, so it's also used to break the hydrophobic interactions in cells, so it makes all sense. And we observed that with urea, the dissolution was better, it facilitates, we don't see that much of aggregates in solution and the long fibers that we see when we don't have urea. So this was perhaps the first time we could really visualize, at least to my knowledge, we could visualize an effect of this of this additive, urea. So once we have the material in solution, we want to bring back and shape it in films, particles, whatever. And like Magnus said, we need to know how to do that process, to control what drives the aggregation of cellulose molecules, how to tune that. Could be very important for triboelectric applications, but can be very important for other applications as well. And we have done some work with Ulf Olsen. He ended up being my PhD supervisor several years ago, but now he's also interested in cellulose and trying to understand what triggers the gelation and how we go from a liquid-like to a solid-like, and how that occurs and why it occurs and how can we control that. And for instance, in the sodium hydroxide-based track, we observe that at room temperature, a solution can be maintained for a couple of hours very easily. As soon as we start increasing the temperature, the gelation time drops a lot and the solution is more prone to gellify. So, and we observed that during this gelation process, Bragg reflection was showing up. So that gave us an idea of getting some kind of crystallites being developed there and working as a kind of bridge points between the cellulose molecules and eventually building up a 3D network that justifies this kind of gelled state. Okay, so that's to make the long story short, to understand a bit the mechanism behind the gelation. And of course, this is important for fiber spinning because the fiber properties at the end depend very much on the way the solution is, how well dissolved it is, and the way we coagulate, the way we precipitate the fibers. But it's also very important for other type of fibers. For instance, for food applications. I brought this picture here because this was very special to me. I was in a conference in Noi, and I was near a poster, and then the owner of that poster, Professor Yamane, also a Japanese guy, very known in the cellulose field, came to me and we were chatting, and suddenly he opened a bag and he gave me some noodles. And these were, okay, so he tried first, and then I ate them afterwards. And these they were made from softwood sulfide pulp. So the way these noodles are done, the way they spun has to be controlled. So the way they regenerate these noodles has to be, I mean, it's not just random. So it's important to do regeneration for fiber, for textiles, but also for fiber-like noodles. And talking about food applications, we then got involved in some of other projects related with food, where the idea was to encapsulate probiotic bacteria. As you might be aware, probiotics are claimed to do health benefits for us, and nowadays everyone wants these functional foods for this and that. We are no longer happy with having a food just providing nutrients. It has to help the hair and helps to help the needle, the nails, whatever. And our contribution here was to try to develop cellulose-based particles to encapsulate probiotics so they can then be included in the food matrix in a safer way, and then they can kind of survive during the digestion and do their job once they reach the intestine. So we have done stuff with cellulose-based particles, including other additives such as cyclodextrins. We have done water-in-water emulsions using cellulose derivatives and gelatin, and the bacteria there kind of decorate the emulsion and stabilize the emulsions. Evaluate the viability, cytotoxicity, and so on, and also looking at different shapes, in this case films, not for triboelectric applications, but doping the films with bacteria, thinking about a sort of smart packaging with bacteria, or, well, might be too stupid, but at the time we sell the idea as a kind of a publication. It was very important for my PhD student. So this was also very interesting to work on a totally different area from textile-based fibers to more something related with food applications. And as Magnus said, we explored these amphiphilic-like properties from cellulose in the emulsion formation, and we gladly had Orlando there to be the main opponent of Carolina. And what I want to highlight here is that in some of these works we have used diffusion wave spectroscopy, which I don't know if you are totally familiar with. And I just want to take this opportunity, because it's something we have back home, to briefly say that with this kind of methodology, we use emulsions as a kind of tracer, so they're Brownian diffusion in the solution. We can then extract the intensity correlation function, the mean square displacement, and from there we can get information about the rheological properties and about the size and so on. So, and that was quite nice to characterize these cellulose-based emulsions, which has not been done before. And just to illustrate, I believe you are familiar with the normal common mechanical rheometry, but then it has a hardware limitation that we cannot access to larger frequencies. We cannot just oscillate forever. So with this optical light-based method, we can access much higher frequencies, and we can kind of complement both the mechanical and the optical properties, check the storage and the loose moduli and so on. So it's a nice process, a nice technique to characterize these emulsion-based systems. Eventually also follow the aging and stability of emulsions. Since emulsions start to coalesce, become bigger or whatever, the intensity correlation function will obviously change with time, so you can extract also some kinetic parameters from it. So I believe it's a nice method to apply. Something totally different. Now this lady, she was in Sundsvall recently, and she's working on developing cellulose-based derivatives for microplastic flocculation. We know that microplastics are everywhere. We know that they are eventually bad. We don't know how bad they are at this stage. We don't know their real impact so far, but we know that perhaps it's too late. It's not too late, but before being too late, it's better to do something at this stage. And what we are trying to do is to develop these novel cellulose-based flocculant agents that we can then kind of aggregate the cellulose particles, getting bigger aggregates, and then eventually they will either sediment, or we can easily remove them with filtration, and they don't end up in the rivers or oceans. So that's our tiny and humble contribution to the world eventually. So this is part of Solange's PhD. We are also working with other biopolymers. I brought this one because it's also funny, the silk fibrin, which is a protein in silk. We have applied, and like cellulose, it's also hard to dissolve. It's very painful to dissolve silk, but we have applied the same knowledge we have done for cellulose in silk. We kind of some success, being successfully, well, we could dissolve it in this kind of tetrabutylammonium hydroxide and in other solvents. And more recently, we also did some stuff with ionic liquids to generate carbon dots from silk. And depending on the synthesis conditions, we can get then particles of different sizes. And these particles of different sizes then have different types of emission. And more interesting, apparently this mixture of this silk-based particles with the ionic liquid can build up the so-called ion nanofluids, which show very interesting thermal properties. In fact, we can store a lot of energy there. Who knows if it's not the future of solar energy systems. So we are just starting digging on this. I'm more on the rheological side of these fluids and less on this type of characterization, but it's something really recent. Other stuff that I would like to share with you, within this Mediterranean context, this plant is very famous as an important carob. I don't know how well you know this plant, but perhaps you already heard about lactose green gum, or this symbol here, which appears in a lot of food formulations, in ice creams, in yogurts, whatever. So it's a thickening agent, and it's extracted from the seed, which only 10% of the fruit is the seed, and people extract this galactomannan from the seed, and then there are a lot of leftovers, and we are trying to modify these polymers that we find here to get new cationic and anionic derivatives to build up new hydrogels. And since I'm in a plant biotechnology lab, the idea is to improve the crop production and development to kind of have a smart hydrogel system where we can dope them with nutrients or fertilizing agents or use the water in a clever way and having a kind of more fancy delivery of these agents, which eventually will help will benefit the crop grow. So it's something interesting that we are just starting now. Lignin is something that we are working with. Too, this lady there is about to finish her PhD. She did a lot regarding lignin dissolution and extraction, and a bit also on the development of materials. I just highlight this kind of novel dissolution system based on luvulinic acid, where we can really extract high concentrations of lignin with a reasonable high purity, milder conditions. We can recycle the solvent several times. It works with hardwood and softwood, so we are quite happy about this solvent that Elodie has kind of she found. And then the lignin properties are kind of different from other properties, and we are exploring that in other materials such as foams. We are also doing some work on foam development, so using lignin, this polyphenol, to substitute phenol in these foams, and also using lignin and modify lignin in this case to get new cationic derivatives for hair care applications to replace the synthetic polymers we have in hair care formulations now by lignin-based polymers. So that's part of Carolina's thesis too. What else? Composites with lignin, so nothing really special here, different shapes, different forms, lignin, and also already with the raw materials, nothing really special here. But and finally, I just brought this picture because we are also, aside from lignin, we are also doing some stuff with tannins, other polyphenol, and with deep eutectic solvents, and we find that we can dissolve them, and eventually, in some conditions, we get some sort of particles, these kind of cubic-like particles, and this reminds me a paper from Orlando a couple of years ago, where with tannic acid, he showed the formation of different colloidal-like aggregates, changing the quality of the solvent and the time. So this is something that we are definitely interested in, and we will look at this more carefully in the future for sure. So I'm coming to an end. Just to thank all the people that has been working on this for the last couple of years. Of course, the funding agencies are very important. I have to thank my fellow Swedish friends who invited me to join this trip to UBC, and of course Orlando for hosting our and putting this awesome program here for our stay, and thank you for your attention too.